Professor Kravitz yesterday talked about the relationship between teachers and students and the transition between the two roles. And now that we've been designated as world leaders, we have to try to also stand up to the expectations. And as such, as far as I know, there's not a single document, not in terms of policy or even in terms of regulations, that conveys a clear or even vague expectation that the services or practitioners convey or implement services that are based on evidence or that that are recovery oriented. True, we've made a lot of progress and there's a lot of talk about it and practice, but we still, the challenge stands in front of us to try to actually develop a way in which we have it down in writing, have it down as something that is an expectation, and have it in a way that we may be able to follow upon that. And I think that Dr. Hogan's presentation yesterday is something we can look forward to in terms of a sort of important guide, leading document and intention. So I think that's something else. I'm delighted to invite to the stage our four guests. So we would have the opportunity to ask them different questions. Just from talking with people informally in this short break, both presentations were very well received, generated a lot of issues, curiosity. And so if you could kindly please come up here. And as we did with the previous sessions, we will take questions from the audience. And we'll count what percentage each one of them answers. And I'll actually follow Professor Kravitz's trick from yesterday and say, well, because I'm the moderator, I'll take the opportunity to ask the first question. And I know that these two forces have been major issues within the mental health systems. And often there have been some degree of tension between these two sources and a lot of questioning about how they relate to one another and whether they contradict, whether they're complementary. And I was wondering about your thoughts about the relation between evidence-based practice and between recovery.
Max Lackman. More specifically about the question of David, you have whole talk about the notion of evidence, but as one who make qualitative research and work with narrative, and I think that not often what we can learn from narrative. And you talk about narrative and how also in narrative in practice we learn things is taken as account as a evidence for best practice, and I want to think about the notion of evidence can also be something who can make a bridge between personal recovery and evidence-based practice. How can we combine the two? How can we put a more narrative evidence into evidence-based practice?
I'm Rani Dudai from the Ministry of Health. Thank you for the compliments. We had a lot today, but in the last 2 days, we really feel a bit in brainstorm. Especially, I'm referring to your lecture from 2 days, Bob Drake, about the shelter vocational. We felt that rightly you remarked that you feel that there is a lot of sheltered vocational rehabilitation in Israel, and indeed it is a lot. And I want to ask you 2 questions about this. You said in your lecture that there are 60% of the people who didn't succeed to go into the supported employment, And is it possible that some of them could enjoy some kind of sheltered vocational, not just coming and working, but as a place, you know, to start off? That's my first question. And the second one, supporting employment has a lot of kinds. What do you mean about supporting employment? Is it full-time job in a regular salary? Can it be less? And what about employers? Here in Israel, we have a lot of stigma for taking mentally ill patient to work. And there isn't any policy that help us to make it better. So we are afraid that if we release the 60,000 people who are in sheltered places and prefer them to regular work, that not many employers will join us in this bargain. So what can we do about this? If you know, if you are doing, are there any kind of benefits to employers in this field? And of course, it's for all kind of handicap, but I'm talking especially about our patients. And the last thing I want to ask, is it possible that people with mental health have another kind of vocational that you didn't remark? Like when you see yesterday the people who made a show, we are referring to make them professional in many kind of fields and give them the chance to be maybe independent, I don't know. But is it possible that there are some kind of vocational that you didn't mention that can be also available to us?
I wanted to make one general thought about, maybe this applies to several things, but in particular, the tension between rehabilitation and recovery. And to say that it seems to me we often have a distinctly Western mindset to parse the differences between things, rehabilitation versus recovery. And when things are new, as some of these thoughts are new, it seems to me to be much more useful to put both thoughts in the same place and to think of rehabilitation and recovery, and to try to keep these opposing concepts, or quantitative and qualitative, or professional knowledge and personal knowledge, and to keep both concepts in the same place and then work with the good tension between these places, rather than create an either-or mentality that says we have to make a choice. Because we have to make a choice, lines will be drawn, barriers will not be crossed, we won't have the opportunity to move forward. So to think about several of these things in a, not an either-or framework, but a both and framework. Just one general or beginning thought.
Great, thank you. Fantastic questions. Two I'd like to pick up on the question of the relationship between evidence-based practice and recovery. I think has two answers. One is there's no intrinsic tension. It's just that sometimes evidence-based practice has focused on particular things that really matter to clinicians, and perhaps insufficiently focused on particular things that really matter to consumers. So, for example, having a meaningful life, having an experience of empowerment, having hope, and having social opportunities are all potential targets of interventions, and they could be the primary outcome of those interventions, and we don't yet have a good, rich evidence base for how to support those kind of desirable outcomes. And therefore, we don't have a good understanding of the relationship and maybe even the trade-off between different sorts of outcome. And it may be the case that we can't have everything. And science and research has an awful lot it can contribute to what, at the end of the day, I think is a matter of values, what we're really here for, but it can empirically inform that debate. Just to mention, we're starting a 28-service randomised control trial in 3 months' time of an intervention to explicitly support personal recovery, and our outcome measure, our primary outcome for that trial is personal recovery. So it's not about symptoms, it's not about social disability, it's the experience of recovery. So it is possible to sit within the paradigm, but it also potentially points to methodological extension. So one thing we're also piloting is whether it's possible to extend trial methodology to not have an invariant outcome used as the judge of the effectiveness of the intervention for all participants in the study. Because trial methodology says you say in advance what the intervention is intended to improve, and the problem is people are different. So for one person, symptoms really matter. For another, they're not so important. For a third person, they don't matter so much. So we're also doing methodological extensions to consider individualized outcomes and whether they're useful as a means of understanding the impact of an intervention. And then just second brief point, in terms of the role of narrative, in the Personal Recovery and Mental Illness book I did, there's a section called The Contribution of Narrative to Recovery. There's also a section called The Contribution of Rehabilitation to Recovery. There's a section called The Contribution of Values-Based Practice to Recovery, and a section called The Contribution of Evidence-Based Practice to Recovery. And I agree with Mike, it's unhelpful to polarize into good or bad. It's about positioning and understanding what is helpful for what.
Thank you. So I'd like to respond to the question about employers and helping them to treat people fairly when they apply, and they also have a history of mental illness. So in my country 2 weeks ago we had a new law called the Equality Act, and this is a restructuring of gender and ethnic and age and all the other disability laws discrimination laws that we had in recent years. And one of the elements of this new act is that it's now unlawful to ask health-related questions on an application form when you apply for a job. So you can't say, what is your medical history? Do you have a psychiatric history? And so on. And the advantage of that is that the employer will still want to know about that, and that will be picked up at what we call the occupational health check stage after an interview. But you cannot refuse somebody to be shortlisted for an application for interview on the basis of their health background, nor can you refuse somebody at interview for offering the job, because you don't know that as an interviewer or as a boss. Now, so that's helpful to sort of defer that sort of rejection stage. One of the implications then, if you already have a job and you have a mental illness, or if you manage to get through an application successfully, is the dilemma for an individual about whether you disclose or not, and if you just simply lie or fail to present the full truth about a condition. And there are grey areas here. A person might honestly say, I do not have a mental illness. Yes, 10 years ago I was depressed for a little while, but I recovered from that. Now I'm well. There's no need for me to declare. Now, in law in my country, you have to answer the precise question. So if it says, have you ever been given a diagnosis? Then that person has to say, yes, 10 years ago I did. If the question says, do you have a mental illness? A person might say, no, I do not have. I've now fully recovered from it. Now, for those people who don't feel that they're fully cured, if you like, then there's still a dilemma about whether to conceal or disclose. And in my country now, the balance of judgment for most people is to say nothing at all to anybody, because they'll be very heavily penalised and stigmatised if they do disclose. If they choose to say something, then they are open to get the benefits of the relevant Discrimination Act. And we have something called the Disability Discrimination Act. There's an American equivalent. I've heard yesterday that you have an equivalent as well. The problem then is that employers don't really know what to do if it is disclosed. So they have this concept we call reasonable accommodations or reasonable adjustments, whereby the employer is obliged in law to make some modifications to allow that person who is qualified for the job and employed to be able to do those tasks and those roles reasonably well. Now in a wheelchair it's pretty clear. You have ramps, you have lifts, you have sort of physical modifications. Many employers in my country have no idea what a reasonable adjustment would be for somebody with a mental illness, with a mental condition. So, I mean, this isn't rocket science. It's quite a simple thing to convene groups of service users and say, you know, what have you found is helpful? Often there are things like flexibility in travel times to work, avoiding crowded, you know, buses or trains or whatever, having maybe quiet spaces from time to time for work or for recovery, maybe having more frequent or more specialized forms of support or supervision or mentoring, the whole series of things that can be very helpful to people, especially people returning to work after a period of mental ill health. But that information isn't, certainly in my country, is not in the public domain about what employers should need to know to do their job well according to the law. So I think there's a way to go on that. Now there's just another piece as well, which relates to some work that David Rouet is doing. It's not enough simply to help employers to treat people fairly at an application point. And by, I don't mean that they should not discriminate. I mean they should not discriminate unfairly. So if I apply for a job, I'm on antidepressants, my cognition, I'm slightly sedated, my memory, my concentration isn't so good, then I would expect to be rejected and discriminated against if I apply for a train driver job because I'm slightly sedated. That would be fair discrimination. I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to unfair discrimination simply categorically because I might have any mental illness. Now, so helping employers to treat people fairly on their merits for applications is one thing, but we know from recent research we've done on discrimination with people with schizophrenia and with depression actually, that at least half of such people won't ever apply for a job because they fully expect to fail. Sometimes this is called internalized stigma, sometimes it's called self-stigma. We tend to conceive this as anticipated discrimination. So it seems to me then you both need to work with employers and you need to offer help to individuals, for example, structured individual or group psychological help, so they gain confidence to be empowered to actually apply for a job, and then at the same time the employers, we hope will have had interventions to help them to treat those applications fairly on their merits. And it's two together, I think, may help to reduce discrimination and stigma.
So, Max, I wanted to first say something about narrative evidence, and I think you know Kim Muser and some of our group who do some of these things, and you know that we have several anthropologists in all of our studies that we try to use mixed methods, and my experience over time has been that the qualitative research and the phenomenological research has really been what's helped us to develop interventions that actually work in the real world as opposed to, you know, theory or other ways of getting at interventions. And one of the things that's going on now that I think is a beautiful example of this is Pat Deegan's work on Common Ground, where she's really spent years interviewing clients about how they think about controlling symptoms and how they think about using medications and not using medications and how they respond to many of the morale breaking messages that they get from professionals about medications and about their illnesses. But she's gone on and tried to work with the people with mental illness to transform those kinds of messages and the kinds of interactions that we set up so that now when people come in, before they see their doctor, they go to the shared decision-making center and they put in you know, their power statement, and they're helped by peers to come up with the power statement, so that, and their power statement might be something like, you know, I need you, Dr. Jones, to help me figure out a dose of medicine that's not going to overwhelm me and cloud me and make me tired, but is going to enable me to be a good mother, because that's the most important thing in my life. And it also enables people to put in their record, and as part of the interaction with their doctor, all of the other things that they've learned help them to control symptoms, you know, from using headphones to listening to, music, to taking time outs, to doing math problems, et cetera, et cetera. Doctors usually don't know about all these things, but most people, if you really talk to them in detail, have discovered all sorts of ways to control their symptoms themselves, in addition to medications. So anyway, I think Pat's work is the most beautiful example of using narrative evidence to try to move towards effective practices and to help clinicians do a better job, which they want to do, but they often don't have the knowledge, don't get the information they need. And then, Ronnie, I appreciate your questions, and let me say a few things about supported employment. I'll start by saying I think I was a bit jet-lagged on Monday and not very clear about what I was trying to say, but one of the main things I was trying to say is that, for me, the most shocking thing in my professional career is the first time we closed a sheltered workshop and we followed up all of the people, and many had gone, about half of them had gone to work, and they loved working and they much preferred it to the sheltered workshop. But one of the things that surprised me was the other half were also much happier with what they were doing. And some of them had started a peer support center, and some of them were doing volunteer jobs, and some of them were going to the senior center, and some of them were going to the local health club, and they had gotten scholarships for them. They were doing a whole range of other things. 100% of them preferred these other things to the sheltered workshop that they had been in. And that shocked me. It sort of made me realize that, okay, we had been in the hospital days socializing people into patienthood, and now in the community mental health days, we were replicating that experience. We were also we were rounding up our patients. We used to go pick up everybody with a van and bring them in so we could bill Medicaid for a day. And we were, again, segregating them and socializing them into being patients. And now that I've studied about a dozen of these closures of day treatment and sheltered workshops and other arrangements, the findings are always exactly the same. If you really work with people and listen to what they want and help them find what they want in the community, there's a wide variety of things. As regards work, which is what most of the people want, most people are afraid to work if they haven't worked in many years. And so the art of supported employment is finding the right placement that matches what they want to do, and finding an employer who's willing to let somebody start out very part-time. So we have a lot of clients who start out 2 hours a week and then gradually build up if they like the job and the employer likes them, so that at the end of 6 months, the average person is working 22 hours a week. Almost nobody in our system goes on to full-time employment, and that's because if they work full-time, they not only lose their disability payment, but they lose their health insurance, which is a disaster for them. Our country is the only Western country, I think, that ties your disability to your health insurance. Now, hopefully the Obama health reform plan is going to get us out of this terrible dilemma so that people will have their health insurance, and then they can make independent decisions about how much they want to work. Because I've talked to many, many, many clients and employers who've said, well, we'd really like Joe to work full-time. He's a great employee, but he can't work more than 22 hours, or he'll be over the level where he'd lose his insurance. So that's been a bad dilemma for us. We do definitely see some people who like volunteer work. We see some people who like starting their own business. We see a small number of people who try working and then decide, hey, I really want to do volunteer work. I have a good friend who he tried several jobs, and he just didn't find any of them as satisfying as working as a volunteer in the hospital. So he goes to the hospital every day with his guitar, and he plays and sings around the different units of the hospital, and he just finds that more satisfying than getting paid for work. There are lots of different strategies for working with employers, by the way. One of the nice ones that I've seen in recent years is that towns will have a conference through the Better Business Bureau or some other group of employers, and they'll have a panel of employers who have been hiring people with disabilities get up and talk about, you know, how well it's worked and what it's been like and why they believe in it now, and encourage the other business people in the community to do the same thing. You know, over the long run, we've really got to overcome these discrimination issues, and I think tax incentives is another plan that many countries are using or considering using to help increase the work opportunities for people with all kinds of disabilities. I can tell you my own experience as an employer is the same thing that I've heard from dozens of other employers, which is that you know, people who work with us who have disabilities are, you know, they're good workers, and they're no better or worse than other workers that we hire. Because we work in mental health research, they have some special talents to lend in the setting. But what really makes them a little bit different is that they tend to be more loyal workers than the rest of the workforce. And I've heard this again and again and again from employers that, you know, this is a person who really appreciates having a good job and has a positive impact on the other employees in my setting.
Thank you. Galia Moran, recently Boston University, now Department of Community Mental Health and University of Haifa. Continuing with the theme of bridging rehabilitation and recovery and all stakeholders in the mental health field, I'd like to ask a question about the issue of psychiatric diagnoses, psychiatric knowledge, the more traditional bodies of knowledge, clinical, psychological, clinical, you know, psychodynamic approaches. How do we bridge the gap with them? How do I bring my fellow clinical psychologists into this field? And how do we not lose some maybe valuable knowledge that can be useful within psych rehab from those bodies of knowledge?
My name is Benny, and I work in the Consumer Provider Project in Israel. I'm also a consumer representative in the National Council for Mental Rehabilitation. And I want to ask about the big project of the evidence-based. I heard that there were also consumers integrating in the ACT teams and in the IMR interventions. And you said you did a lot of research and study. I wonder if you have any conclusions, or did you study or research the impact of the consumers in those teams? Is there a difference between an ACT team with a consumer provider or a peer specialist, as you call it, or against the ACT team without it? Or is there an impact in the IMR intervention provided by a consumer? I wonder if you did any study on this and you have any conclusions. I would like to hear about it.
One of the things that I felt that those lectures that we heard today and yesterday were great, but you convinced the already convinced. We know that. Not exactly what you said, but we are convinced that this is a good way to go about. Maybe we don't know many things. The question that I have, which is critical, in my opinion, how do we move the workforce, the clinicians, the doctors, the other people that know their stuff from 20 years ago, their livelihood depends on that, they feel safe with that, this is part of their identity. How do we help them change? And the same thing goes to organizations. The organizations make their money, feel safe for their existence in preserving the old styles, and including policymakers. You know, just to mention something, sometimes it seems to me that society punishes success. I think Professor Drake mentioned that people with mental disability cannot work more than half a position because otherwise they would lose their benefits, their healthcare insurance, and this and that. So becoming better, they are punished for that. What do we do?
Thanks. Rami Rudnik from Canada. Again, congratulations for the presentations today as yesterday. I think inspiring, informative, and very thought-provoking. I wanted to just kind of sharpen Uri's question just a bit and put a bit of a challenge there. We know from stigma research and discrimination research, maybe more generally, that human contact improves attitudes. But we know that from the mental health workforce, of course, that workforce is continuously in contact with people who have mental health challenges, but we also know that that has not changed or improved attitudes. So what are your thoughts on how to move forward in improving the attitudes of mental health providers? Both psych rehab practitioners, where there's also stigma, we know that, but also more generally, ambulatory services, inpatient services, outreach services, etc., in order to be more supportive and facilitative of recovery. And I would say, Mike, both as personal recovery, meaning as processes, but also recovery as outcomes that go beyond symptom alleviation. Thank you.
The last question for this bunch.
Well, Uri and Rami actually preempted one of my questions. The audience of clinicians and people who make decisions about health are not here. And much of what you said should be heard to them, and the question is how to do it, how to bring it to their attention. But I wanted also to address the employment, the supported employment that Graham and also you referred to. Obviously there are impediments, hindrances, obstacles for mentally disabled, and also, by the way, for people not only psychiatric problems, but also the retarded people have problems with getting to employment. And this is dealt in Israel not through the law of rehabilitation, but through another law, which is the equitability law for people with disability, about accessibility to services and to employment. And as you noted, the idea of the physical disabilities and sensual disabilities are well understood by the politicians and by the public, and they do not know what is the obstacles for people with mental health problems. And this is an issue which we fight every day when we go to the parliament or to the people who work on this equitability law. And here we need a more clear message how to write in the accessibility regulations to services in general and employment in particular for people with mental disability and also retarded people. So this is really a challenge, and this will help, I hope, to get more and more people to the employment, which is, of course, excellent path.
Okay, so I'll start this time and go quickly. I should answer the question about the involvement of consumers in the National Evidence-Based Practices project. We didn't get as full of an involvement as we would like, and we didn't study that in terms of quantitative outcomes. But there were many of the teams that did involve consumers as part of the team and part of the delivery. And in the work that we're doing now with decision support systems, we have peer support people who are the ones that introduce the clients to the electronic decision supports and help them learn how to use the computer and all of that. And I think the general finding here, which is consistent across all these studies, which Pat Deegan talks about all the time, is that you know, having a consumer there as part of the workforce all the time in every setting, you know, keeps people honest about their attitudes and keeps them from falling back into pejorative language and doing and saying harmful things. So one of Pat's interventions, which I like, is that she says, okay, you know, we're all prone to misuse language and to say things that are discriminatory or negative or unhopeful or whatever. And so let's just have we'll put a little jar in the middle of the table in the office, and anybody can call anybody else, including you can call me on this. And anytime one of us says something that others identify as, you know, these kinds of negative or confidence busting comments, you'll have to put a nickel in. And the team gets used to this, and it's a fun activity. But it starts to make people conscious of the language and attitudes that they express every minute of the day.
Where does the money go?
Party. So I'll pick up on the stigma and social contact, Rami, I think you mentioned. The main thing is that by far the strongest effect that we know about to reduce stigmatization is having direct contact with people with mental illness. But there's an exception, which is people who work in the mental health field, and quite a lot of surveys show that they are at least as stigmatizing as the general public, and some studies show them actually more so. So there's a paradox here. One way to understand that is what, in fact, Mike, you mentioned the other day, which is often called the physician's bias, which is that certainly what I do as a doctor is I continue to see people who don't get better. So over time, as I've accumulated experience over years and decades, so I don't see in front of me people who do very well and get better and run their lives. I see people who have the worst outcome, who keep coming back because they're still not well, still not well. So my accumulated experience over time becomes more and more, the content of that is about people who have the worst sort of course and outcome. And so I have a particularly miserable view of the whole range of people with, for example, schizophrenia, because I only see people, the smaller proportion, who aren't really getting better over time. Now, the health, certainly in my country, the health service is a very poor employer of people with mental illness. I don't understand really why that is. I suspect it's to do with the symbolism of people choosing to go into helping professionals who like to feel themselves to be strong or whole or complete, and the inverse is that the others are sort of frail or injured or sick or lesser in some extent. About 50 years ago, when my sister was born, my mother had a period of severe postnatal depression, and she was off work. She was working as a district nurse, we'd now call it a community nurse, and she took about 2 years off work. She was very unwell, and in fact she needed some electroconvulsive treatment before she got better. And a little while ago I said to her, when you went back to work and you saw your employer and you were ready to return, what did you say about why you'd been off work? And she said, nothing. Are you crazy? I never would have got my job back again if I'd disclosed the reason for my absence from work. And when I talk about that in England to health audiences, people start nodding furiously. And people say things like, it really hasn't changed in 50 years. Our health service is still a very vicious organisation for people who do disclose having a mental illness and sort of casts you out effectively. So I think that there's a lot to learn. And in Europe anyway, in the bigger Europe, our National Health Service is the second biggest employer after the Red Army. So this is the big organisation. And that's also a big blockage to actually incorporating. And so, of course, a lot of people in the health service do have a history of mental illness, but they're actually deliberately closing it and sort of keeping quiet all the time. So I think one thing is to promote ways of disclosure. Another thing is to include deliberately to employ people within our health and care workforces who are disclosing mental illness, and that's seen as a strength, as we've been talking about. But I think there's a way to go, a long way to go, actually.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up Gallia's point about diagnosis. I think we need to remember two truths in relation to diagnosis. The first is that diagnosis is a lifesaver. for some people some of the time. Making sense of the experience and understanding you're not alone and understanding that help may be available is a reason that many people are alive today. So diagnosis is a real contribution to some people's recovery. But we also need to understand that for other people, it's a death sentence. It's a toxic identity that is highly stigmatized and negative and inevitably associated with downward deterioration. So what we need to do as clinicians is to do that complex values balancing, that we have expertise that is of high value to some people some of the time. We should actively seek to use that expertise to do good professional assessments, arrive at understandings expressed, for example, as diagnosis or formulation, and offer that as a resource to the person in their journey of recovery, offering it tentatively as a resource rather than a revealed truth. And that requires real skill. The second strand about the stigma aspect, my own guess of why it is that mental health professionals don't reduce stigmatizing beliefs through contact is because they don't have human contact. They primarily live in what I called in my overhead the detached relationship experience. They are a professional with a patient. And that's a different kind of relationship to either the partnership or the real relationship. And that's why I suspect reducing stigma held within the mental health system will involve changing the basic way of relating between people who work in the system and people who use the system. And just finally, in terms of Ori's point about changing systems, it may be worth looking at the free-to-download document that I mentioned, called Implementing Recovery, which is exactly for an English context, trying to grapple with that challenge of how do you transform the system.
So I'll think out loud a little bit about the question of how to make change. And I guess here's the way that I would think about it. I would do something that should be done, that can be done, that might be effective. I wouldn't worry about what can't be done. I wouldn't worry about how to convince the people that aren't in the room, or how to get to the people who we don't think will change their minds and change their minds. As they say in Brooklyn, forget about it. So then the question is, where does that very simple framework, what should be done, that can be done, that might work, where does that take you? And it makes me think of a research project that we conducted in Ohio, looking at many different teams and many different community agencies, deciding whether or not to try to adopt one of these evidence-based practices, whether they would make the decision or not, whether they would be successful in getting started, and then whether they would succeed in implementing it. And so I would recommend some of the work from that little study to take a look at. Its name was Innovation, Diffusion, and Adoption Research Project, IDARP. So if you just Google search IDARP, you'll find some of this stuff. And the findings were all completely consistent with logic. It turns out that a leader of a community organization deciding to do something like this, or whether to make a commitment to a process of adoption or innovation, makes a decision essentially based on risk. Is this are we gonna look better or compete better if we do this than not? If everybody else is doing it and we don't do it, then we're gonna look bad. But if nobody else is doing it and we do it first, we might fail. So the frame for this was that decision to make this change is a decision made under conditions of risk. So the question is, what will change that risk and make it more desirable? It turns out that research evidence doesn't have that much to do with decision makers interest in making a change. So I remember one study that looked at the use of information by bureaucrats related to change. It turns out that bureaucrats, I'm one of them, so I can relate, use information that comes across their desk when it is relevant to a decision they have to make at that moment, when it's consistent with their internal suspicions, and when it's easy. So these things are relatively common sense at some level. Then it turns out that so figuring out how to make it somewhat easy to do this is a really important first step. So the toolkits, for example, that Bob worked on are a really good resource, but they're not sufficient to get this this done. You're going to need some other help. One of the things that people will evaluate if they're interested in maybe making change is, can we do it? You know, and so it turns out the best predictor in this research project of whether people felt that they could do it was they had made a change before and they succeeded. If they'd made no changes before, they felt paralyzed about making a change. Surprise, surprise. So something else that was very useful was, can we get any help? And I think this was one of the limitations in the States in the evidence-based project, because the federal government worked with Bob to get these toolkits created, but then didn't really do anything to create tangible help to actually use the toolkit. So I remember, Bob, a conversation that we had in Chicago 15 years ago, and I, as a state leader, was scratching my head saying, how do we start to do this stuff? And so I asked Bob the question of, you know, what have you learned about how to do it? And he said, well, this work is done in teams. You have to bring the team in. It's helpful to have the whole team. It takes about a week for them to learn how to do it, go out and watch other people doing it in the field, make their plans to do it at home, and then after they go home, they need some support by a phone call or something like that. So that led me to say at the time, and actually this is a suggestion that maybe impertinently I'll make to you, that sending people to Dartmouth or BU or something else to get this done in Israel is probably not a great strategy. There are too many airplane tickets involved. So I think it would be very useful to think about, is there some way to create some center or resource somewhere in the state of Israel that can help with some of these projects. Maybe this can be done in government. We do some of this in government, but in government we're not so good at providing the flexible support. So just before I meander too much, to pick something that should be done, that can be done, that might work, and then probably that leads me toward creating some capacity to begin to help people who are interested to make the change, whether it's using evidence-based practices or whether it's exploring a framework of recovery capabilities.
Hi, my name is Oren Derry, and I wanted to ask a few things and share my experience from the field. I think the psychiatric rehabilitation is beautiful because it enables change. It enables change not only among the consumers, only among the practitioners. And I think, I just wonder if like I change in this process and other people change and the consumer change, so it must change the society in some ways. So I just wanted to ask you about this aspect. And how do you think it relates to other processes, other society processes or fields that are growing up now, like ecology or alternative medicine, that has, for my opinion, like very similar holistic way of thinking, and maybe it tells us something bigger, maybe we can cooperate and make it wider in a wide perspective. And something else I wanted to ask about stigma among practitioners. I want to share my own experience. I think I want to ask about the course of stigma among practitioners. Like when I started to work in the field, so I felt my stigma is getting worse among the people. And just after a few years, I started to realize what's the process I've been through, and I wanted to ask you about this course, if you can tell something about this.
First, I would also like to thank you for the excellent and inspiring lecture. I would like to share with you that after a year of teaching Professor Slade's book, Personal Recovery, my students' reaction had been that this is an excellent book which created a paradigm shift in their thinking. But when they are going back to the field, they feel a major gap between the excellent idea, which they are convinced about the personal recovery, and the reality in the field. And my question is, first, how not only to empower clients, but how to empower the workers to create a change in the field. And when we are speaking about programs such as supported employment, it's clear to me how to promote the personal recovery orientation. But what about rehabilitation programs such as residential facility treatment programs, where there are regulations and rules, and the personal recovery approach is not always feasible? And in these situations, our workers are encountering difficulties to promote the personal recovery approach. So perhaps one of the ways is to combine the rehabilitation and recovery, but yet I think that there is a tension between the personal recovery and the rules and regulations of institutions. And I would like also to ask a question about the evidence-based practice. I observed last year Professor Lieberman in Los Angeles advancing the social skills approach and supported employment. And I wonder whether there are other innovative approaches which could advance the supported employment or other evidence-based practices.
I'm Shira. I'm also representative of the consumer movement. I would like to ask about wellness and general health of people suffering from mental illness. I think it's a very neglected subject in our country, and we would like your advice as to how to promote this issue, this important issue.
Max.
Very short remark and a question. I want to say about what Mike Slade said the session before, that in Israel we don't have psychiatric illness. We have soul illness. If you, we called psychiatric illness as soul illness, and many people don't like this, but it's interesting about your remark about the soul. And secondly, what I want to ask about if we have some evidence-based practice about a very important personal goal that we heard here a lot about parenting. The fact that most of the people want to be married and to have child. We know that more than 30% of the person of psychiatric with psychiatric disabilities have child, are parent. Do we have some evidence or some direction about how to support them? Thank you.
Last question.
Hi, Mark from the Department of Community Mental Health. I would like to ask you a simple question. Maybe each of you have a different answer, but I would like you to relate to the nomenclature of the word client, consumer, patient. How important is it? I consider it rather important because it's an icebreaker or a giveaway or a discussion opener.
So thank you very much. Let me start with my response to the last question in relation to language. I think we need to hold two things. We need to hold that language is important. How you say it is how you see it. Language communicates implicit assumptions, puts people in places, locates possible and impossible discourses. So language is important. But it's not about the language. So endless discussion about language is often, in my experience, a cover or an excuse to not engage with what it is about, which is about the core values with which we are working and communicating. In relation to the question about broader changes, I think the recovery agenda and approach is very consistent with other changes I see in society. So in my country, for example, education is changing. 10, 20, 30 years ago, education was about teaching the child. Now, education is about preparing the person for life. Note the change of language, note the different assumptions that it's not just about doing things to the person, but preparing the person to step forward into their life. And I think there are parallel changes in those areas. And then the question about feasibility, well, it's difficult because there are rules and regulations. Yes, absolutely. I work in a community forensic team, which is a team that works with people who have a diagnosis of a mental illness and have committed crimes, which have brought them into contact with the criminal justice system. Every 3 months, the people I work with are on what is called a restriction order. So we need to write a report to our Ministry of Justice to say, have they taken the treatment as prescribed? Have they lived where we expect them to live? Have they done anything that we do not want them to do? So the people I work with sit in a very contained space, even though they live in the community. And I often, in conversations with the service users, the people I work with, will say, okay, we can talk about the things you cannot do if that is helpful to you, but what can you do? What is possible? Those are the questions that create the potential for growth more than focusing on what we cannot do. So it is the art of the possible, I guess. And then just the final suggestion in relation to parenting. I think that there's a general principle that we've touched on in many different ways about the extent to which special help versus everyday help is most applicable. And the Village, the service I talked about earlier in Los Angeles, just to throw out one thought of an interesting thing they do that I found rather shocking. They, many of their clients are young men who want to have a relationship. So before you can be a parent, you need a relationship, and in order to have a relationship, you need to meet someone. So they have lots of young men coming in and saying, you know, I want to find someone to have a relationship with. And their first thought was, okay, well, we need social skills training, we need to build up the social network. And then somebody said, well, hang on, what does everyone else do? Everyone else, well, in that busy town, they go on speed dating. Do you have speed dating here? Yeah? Is there a translation? Okay, so speed dating I can translate is speed dating. And what they experienced was the clients, the consumers, were saying that they were saying, gee, I can't do that. That's too scary.
I'm delighted the speed dating evokes so much attention and excitement. If we can please continue.
So the clients say,
between 1 and 2.
I can't do that. That's too much. And then some of the workers say, gee, yeah, I find that really scary because I'm single and I go. And so workers and clients go together. And they go not as worker and client, but two people looking for a relationship. And that changes the relationship between them. It opens up new possibilities for the individual. And some people have an awful time, and some people have a great time. And sometimes one of the people comes back with a big grin on their face and they're very happy, and sometimes it went very wrong, so they do support around that. But it is real life experiences.
In fact, I'm going to pick up the theme that Mike has just mentioned about the what to do on stigma question. So we're doing quite a series now of intervention studies to change the idea of to eradicate stigma and discrimination. So the social contact is the central idea. So the intervention consists of 2 sessions, about an hour each, something like a group of this, and the teacher is a service user, in fact 2 service users who stand up, and they talk about 3 things. They talk about what's it like to have the primary impairments, so the symptoms, for example. They talk about what it's like to be, what have they experienced in the mental health system, what do the drugs do to them, what's the staff treatment been like. And they talk about their wider experiences of being reacted to in society, in the neighborhood, and by their family as a person with a mental illness. Now, we've used that not just with sort of journalists, and we've used it with police officers, for example, with school children. We've also used it with health professionals. We've done a series of controlled studies with medical students, with psychiatric trainees, with nursing students as well. And it tends to work. So it even works with health professionals. At least it works up to 6 or 12 months. Now, why should that work when all the usual contact we've had doesn't seem to? And it's what was mentioned earlier about the nature of the relationship, particularly the nature of the power relationship. So the social contact seems to work in this stigma-reducing intervention if it's on a relative terms of equality between the teacher, in this case, and the audience. And if what the person, in this case the service user, is teaching, moderately disconfirms stereotypes. So you do not have somebody saying, I have schizophrenia, but now I'm a self-made millionaire and here's my sports car outside. But nor are they looking physically filthy with cigarette burns in the trousers and so on, and just not coping very well. So somewhere in between. They moderately disconfirm the stereotypes. And we found then that that does have a stigma-reducing effect. But it's actually quite a business to train people up to pre-brief, post-brief, debrief for those sessions as well. And also I have mixed feelings about whether this is a long-term sort of career prospect to be a professional patient going around teaching all the time saying, I'm still a patient, listen to me. So we've been trialing recently a DVD with filmed testimony from service users to see whether that's more or less effective than live people. And to my surprise, it's just as good, and in some respects it's better. And we had a particular section of this testimony where people talking about, it's a carer talking about the suicide of a child, which had a greater emotional impact on the audience than any of the live testimonies that we've so far tested. So if that's the case when we repeat it, then that is much more suitable for scaling up to, for example, a regional or a national level. You could do it in all schools if you have a DVD that works and you know it. You have a package to do with that. Briefly then I'll pick up the point about well-being, which now let me check. Do you mean physical health care and physical health wellness?
Sure.
Did you mean physical health when you said well-being? Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. So side effects as well. Okay. Well, the emerging data is that the physical health status and the life expectancy of people with many severe mental illnesses is much, much worse than the whole population. The data I've got are sort of 10 to 15 years less than the average sort of adult. Bob is yesterday mentioning even worse, some studies showing 20 years less expectancy. So effectively we have in our midst, in high-income countries, low-income world health expectations for many people with severe mental illness. It's that degree of disparity. Now, one of the things that my country's just done has had an amazing effect is called QOF. It's called Quality Outcomes Framework. This is a new system to try to make primary care physicians do things differently. And it's usually things like vaccination programs, breast screening programs, preventative work. And now we're introducing more and more elements. And what happens is if GPs hit a target, if you get 80% or more of this, you get an extra payment. So a practice of primary care physicians and nurses and so on might get, I don't know, $20,000 a year extra if all the people on their list who've got severe mental illness have a thorough physical health check every year, bloods, investigations and so on. Now, we don't know yet whether that's going to actually enhance duration of life, but there's good reason to think you would pick up problems earlier on. And it's changed their behavior within 2 years. People always said GPs, they're not interested, they don't do mental illness, they never take proper health assessments, but we've primed them and incentivized them with extra payments, and they have changed their behavior extremely
Let Let me address several questions briefly. In terms of the health and longevity gap, the latest analysis I saw from the US data is that it's 20 to 25 year longevity gap, and 2/3 of that is due to smoking related illnesses. So we're working very hard on programs to help people with mental illness stop smoking. And the good news is that all the early studies that we've done, are very positive. I mean, people want to stop smoking. They know it's bad for their health. They've tried many times on their own without success. They don't know too much about evidence-based practices for smoking cessation. And when you explain all that to them and give them choices about evidence-based practices, about 2/3 to 3/4 of them sign up immediately and say, yes, I'll be glad, I'd like to join a group and I'd like to take one of these medications because I understand the evidence is that gives me the best chance of stopping smoking. So I think that's a huge problem that we really need to solve. And it's being worked on hard by some very good people. I can send you references, and I know there are about 3 papers coming out in psych services from people in our group who are working on this. The question about parenting, Max, you asked that, I think, yeah. There's a very good researcher at the University of Massachusetts named Joanne Nicholson, who has been doing research on this problem for about 25 years. And the studies keep getting better and better. And the general finding is that, yes, people with mental illness are interested in improving their parenting skills and can benefit from, parent teaching and in groups, and can do a much better job and feel good about being parents. And I think everybody knows that many people with mental illness are parents. Many want to be good parents. Many have lost their kids because of drug problems and want to get their kids back. That's their primary motivator for participating in mental health treatment. So I think that's a really important area. And I think if you just Google on Joanne Nicholson, you'll get lots of access to lots of her work. In terms of supplementing supported employment, there are many studies there. And of course, the people who've been studying social skills training for 30 years believe strongly in that approach. We've done 2 studies of supplementing supported employment with social skills training. One with people at UCLA. Neither one of them shows that it improves the vocational outcomes. I think that other people are supplementing supported employment with wellness training, with cognitive training that I described earlier, with some other, evidence-based interventions, dual diagnosis treatment, for example. And there, the results look much more promising, that, there's some kind of additive and maybe even interaction effect. So I would push ahead with those areas instead. The problem of, it's a wonderful thing that you're training your students in recovery orientation and evidence-based practices and all that. We have been had a very hard time in the U.S. getting the training programs to change. The faculty are by and large teaching, psychoanalysis and things that nobody wants anymore, but that's what they know how to do, so that's what they teach. It's been very difficult to change our universities. I don't know if you've had any more success in New York. They're incredibly independent and stuck in old-fashioned ways. In terms of the change process, we keep trying to work with students and set up programs for master's degree students. And by and large, it's people who are out in the field who come in for these programs. And I've come to believe that one of the most important ways to help institute change is to identify the early adopters and work very hard with those programs and get them to change and get them to do a good job, and then set up learning collaboratives and actually show the people the data, and everybody else becomes very, very interested in learning from their peers. You know, people who are on the front lines every day, I don't think they trust academics and they don't trust experts, you know, but they like to learn from their peers. So if you can set up these learning collaboratives out in the real world in the right way, it's just a great thing. I'll give you an example. My colleagues at Dartmouth started a learning collaborative about 10 years ago for all of the cystic fibrosis clinics around the United States. And for the first time, they started by, you know, getting everybody to meet and talk about how great they were doing and learn to trust each other. And yes, we're all doing evidence-based practices. We're all doing exactly the same thing. We're following guidelines. And then everybody collected their data, and, you know, lo and behold, as we knew would happen, there's a threefold difference in expected longevity across certified CF clinics. In some clinics, your child has an average life expectancy of under 20 years, and in some years it's, you know, in some clinics it's out beyond 40 years. And once the clinicians saw those data, they were incredibly interested in finding out what they were doing in the clinics that had so much better outcomes than they had. And they didn't want to hear this from the experts. They wanted to go visit those clinics and talk to their peers who were getting better outcomes. And the experience over 10 years is that every one of the CF clinics has improved longevity by more than 10 years in the absence of any new technology.
Just a couple of very small comments. The one that I would make with respect to parenting is I think it's time for us to bridge the question of the supports that parents living with a mental illness need and the broader task of other people who may not be living with a mental illness but are ill-equipped to parent. Because there are now around the world a number of well-tested interventions for parents who may not be well-equipped to parent, and they generally all involve a structured curriculum and a process of peer support. So, you know, you basically have to teach people the skills, and then they have to practice and learn with each other. In a sense, it's a parenting learning collaborative. And so these approaches, whether it's common sense parenting or the positive parenting program or incredible years, there are a number of them. I think one of the best things we could do for mental health broadly would be to have these available in every community for those parents who want and need them. And then second, to make use of those programs for parents with a mental illness who know they need some support. And I want to make a leap to the question of wellness to make a broader point that may be pretty vague, but I want to make it anyway. And that is that this link between wellness and recovery seems to me to be really important. A consumer colleague of mine in Ohio said to me a few years ago, we are deciding that there is no recovery without wellness. And I thought to myself, you know, this is challenging. This means that unless we can somehow engage with people to help them deal with their general medical health, then we're failing. And this leads me to another task that I think faces all of us, and that is to figure out, it may be different in Israel where your health system is frankly better than in the United States. But in the United States, a lot of people with a serious mental illness who may be going to a mental health clinic don't go to see a doctor, don't go to see a medical clinic. It may partly be because they think they're going to a clinic and they think they're getting health care, but they're not. We're just taking care of them from the neck up. And meanwhile, we're giving them drugs that, you know, make things worse. So I'm actually convinced that unless we have a situation where people do have a good relationship with a doc, that we need to embed medical care in our clinics and treatment programs. Can't do just one thing. If people are able and willing to go see a doctor, that would be fine. But then to extend this, to go back to the other part of the conversation, which is the rest of the healthcare system and the people who are just going in, they're not seeing a specialist yet, they may only have a mild depression or anxiety. That problem is not going to be solved unless we embed mental health people in general medical settings. So I'm convinced that the standard of care in a decade will be that every clinical setting needs to have both mental health capacities and general medical capacities. End of thought.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful opportunity to be able to learn, to ask questions, to discuss answers and thoughts about them. I'm avoiding looking at Uri at the eye because I promised at 1:45 that I'll come up to the stage. I'll be brief in summing up. Just a few small things at least I'll remain with from this wonderful session is the idea of meaningful outcomes that Bob discussed earlier. The importance of, I remember hearing Bob talk in a different setting and saying he never came across a client whose goal was to decrease his BPRS by 2 points or something like that, which is one of the scales which measures symptoms. So the focus on outcomes which are meaningful to the person, following the evidence and the flexibility of evidence, and considering an evidence-based practice as a dynamic, ever-changing process. And that's the wonderful thing about it, rather than a state of what to do and to then rigidly follow those things. The importance also of not only focusing on what can be studied, as we heard from Graham's talk yesterday, when they had the hierarchy, he said, well, there was an emphasis on evidence-based practices, but it wasn't neglecting the possibility, but rather emphasizing the importance of consistently trying out new things for yet there's not yet evidence, and perhaps will be the future and even perhaps better practices. Another thing is the cultural context in which it takes place, which was been emphasized. The issue of ACT was mentioned as something revolutionary and very important in the beginning 80s because it addressed a structural issue and the fragmented services and enabled the services to be provided in a more comprehensive and manner. And so the importance of taking these models and not just implementing them as is, but rather sensitively considering the cultural context in which they are implemented in, as well as the populations, as Dr. Shore mentioned yesterday. And finally, the issue of attitudes, the expectations, the way we refer and the message that we explicitly and implicitly convey in terms of our expectations for the future, and hope as an evidence-based attitude. And finally, I even learned from Mike an outcome measure which can be used, and that's the degree to which people mention their soul when during conversation. So thank you so much for a wonderful presentations this morning, a fruitful discussion, and I think it's exceeded our expectations and hopes for a dialogue and possibility to learn.